At the beginning of time, there were dinosaurs and film cameras ruling the earth together. Then came cavemen and Neanderthals and digital SLRs, the rightful successors to the dinosaurs and film SLRs. And finally, in the modern day, we have hipsters and mirrorless cameras, the essence of modernity. In my previous video on Canon's potential full-frame mirrorless for But in this video I want to talk about what Canon and Nikon both kind of more reasonably need to do to make viable full-frame in particular, but also just in general full-frame, but also just in general mirrorless systems in order to be as effective as humanly possible in the mirrorless competitive space. So speaking to the lens mount, I think that, you know, in my previous video I said probably gonna have to be EF compatible with, speaking specifically to Canon. But you know, it seems like a lot of what we're seeing out of Nikon rumors is that there will be an adapter, something like the LA-EA4 from Sony, with a translucent mirror, what's called a pellicle, in order to be able to mount DSLR lenses to the mirrorless body. I don't think that translucent mirror is necessary. I don't think that that's really got a huge amount of, I mean, I know that what the rumor really is that there's an adapter. I don't think that it needs to have a mirror. I think a mirror is not necessary for there to be effective communication between a lens and a body, between a DSLR lens and a mirrorless body. We're seeing that out of Canon themselves with the adapter that they have from EF to EFM. Now, I also think that you need to have the EFM APS-C and full frame, or the Nikon FM, I'm calling it, APS-C and full frame mounts be the same, just like Sony's are, because you're going to be able to get people to move up in that system because of it being a typical camera system. People are going to want to get the more advanced models, and in particular for Canon, but also for Nikon, the way that they love their market segmentation and their strategy for consumer acquisition and retention is based around lens sales. So if you can have a customer buy an EFM APS-C camera and then you call it the EOS M100, and then they're like, oh, I've discovered that I love photography, I want to get into this. They buy, for example, the Pancake Prime or something else along those lines, and then they get into an EOS M5, for example, and maybe at that point they buy an EFS lens that fills their needs a little better, like the 17 to 55 f2.8 with IS, with optical stabilization. But then from there, they also want to be able to use those lenses on a full frame body that they're lusting after, right? And so I think that there's going to have to be a DX mode, a crop mode that you can put for video at the very least, that you can put those lenses onto those full frame cameras with. So I think that you got to have, much like Sony's already done, a mount that can accommodate both APS-C and full frame lenses, even if those APS-C lenses aren't going to fundamentally cover that full frame. I think too that there will have to be some native mount EFM or FM full frame lenses. I think we can pretty reasonably narrow that down to like a 28 to 70 kit lens or a 24 to 105 kit lens. That's a pretty good kit lens. I think, you know, 24 or 28, 35, 50, 85, 135. I think they're going to have to do, both Canon and Nikon, assuming they're both going to go with a mirrorless system, making a full-frame mirrorless system soon. I think they're both going to need to do that because Sigma is going to be coming out with FE mount lenses, FE mount Art Series lenses very soon, starting, I believe, at the end of the year with the 35 f1.4 Art. And it's going to be so easy for them to, you know, fiddle with a few things and then make that EFM and FM compatible. So out of the Sigma lenses that we should be expecting in FE mount and E mount in general, I think we should also be expecting the 50 to 100 and 18 to 35 f1.8 to also be compatible with EFM mount cameras here very shortly. In terms of zooms though, I think it could also make sense for CaNikon, if you will, to make something like an 11 to 24, 24 to 70, and a 70 to 200, just because that's a very standard range of focal lengths, right? Or 12 or 14 to 24, whatever it ends up being. So I think there's got to be that ultra wide, maybe a 16 to 35 instead of the ultra that between 11 and 14 to 24. I think they could get away with that and not marginalize their sales of their DSLR lenses of that same focal length, because they could cripple them in other ways, like having them only go to f4 as their brightest maximum aperture, or or having them all be variable aperture, something like that. But so you can get that full focal range, pardon me. I think it's possible, continuing with the lenses for just a hot second for one more little note, I think it's possible that CaNikon goes for just a hybrid AF sensor in a DSLR body that you just mount your regular lenses to, and they call that a mirrorless system. However, I think it's more reasonable to expect a completely new system with the EFM/FM mount, because I think both of these companies need to do that in order to be able to continue to differentiate themselves and to show that they're providing value to mirrorless customers that want a smaller form factor, and they're also going to need lenses for those. I think it would be wise for CaNikon to introduce some sort of market segmentation like Sony's done with an A7, with an A7R, and with an A9, where there's your entry level, that would be a 6D sensor or a D750 sensor in that entry level model. I think it would make sense for there to be, an A7R or 5DS / D850 sensor in a full frame mirrorless model to be that general purpose dual, run of the mill professional camera body. And then I think there's also going to have to be a very serious sports photographer mirrorless professional body that would pull specific features from cameras like the 1DX Mark II and the D5 in the vein of the A9. And while in my previous video I said I expect that Canon would have to do something with the 5D Mark IV sensor, I actually think that it makes more sense for Canon in particular to just go with something like the 6D Mark II sensor. The way that Canon reuses their sensors over and over and over, like the 80D, it's in the 80D sensor that's, with tweaks, admittedly, is in something like 8 cameras now. So I think that if Canon and Nikon, but Canon in particular, could put that same exact sensor into more full frame bodies, in this case mirrorless, they'd be able to stick to their margins, they'd be able to stick to their business model ethos, they'd be able to stick to everything that they know and that they're really capable at in terms of market segmentation and delivering slightly nerfed products to market in order to sell higher end products. I think it could make a lot of sense for Canon to put in something like the 6D Mark II sensor, and while I would prefer it to be the 5D Mark IV sensor, I don't see that as being likely. I think that's something I'm more hoping for than realistically expecting. I think it makes a lot more sense for Nikon actually to do the full range between D750 sensors and D5 capabilities between the D750 and the D5 in mirrorless bodies. I think it'll take them a while, just like it's taken Sony a while to really figure it all out. But I think Nikon would be much more interested in doing that full range before Canon would be. And Nikon would have to, because Canon's already got a full suite of mirrorless APS-C bodies, whereas Nikon does not. And so that would be something that they'd also have to be taking into consideration, but they could mitigate some of that by having the full suite of full frame bodies. In terms of hybrid autofocus, I think it makes a lot of sense for Canon to not solely rely on DPAF for stills as well as video. I think that would be very hard to be exactly sure of where you're gonna be focusing on without some kind of nipple to select where you're going to be focusing. I think it makes sense for there to be selectable autofocus points, something like the 45 or 49 or 61 that we're already seeing in Canon bodies. I think those just would have to be on sensor. I don't think that we're going to see a DPAF only autofocus system mirrorless full frame camera out of either company. And Nikon actually does have a DPAF-esque patent, but I can see Nikon doing something closer to, a huge spread of phase detect autofocus points much in the vein of Sony and Fuji. In terms of video, I think more and more people are saying we need our cameras to be true hybrid cameras, true hybrid stills and video shooters. So I think within 3 to 5 years of the first mirrorless full-frame systems from CaNikon coming out, we can expect, sensor agnostic or aspect ratio agnostic sensors like we're about to see out of Sony's Cinealta, newest Cinealta offering. But I think that's a big deal because of the GH5. I think the GH5, I think Sony are both really pushing the ball forward on hybrid features, including video. But starting off, I think full video functionality should be expected. I think peaking, I think zebras will be necessary. I think the first generation will have something like 4K 30 full frame 4K. I think the next generation will have something like full frame 4K 60p. I think there has to be, moving forward on that front as well. You can't just leave it sit and be idle because that is a very competitive market space, the mirrorless market space. However, I can't really see them going past 8-bit 420, in particular because Canon has a Cine line, and although they've developed the XF AVC codec, which should be able to be implemented in any DSLR or mirrorless system that they're making upcoming, I think they're going to keep the 10-bit and the 422 and all that for their Cine line. I think Nikon, however, could put something more advanced like 10-bit 422 and better log functionality into their mirrorless cameras because they don't have a Cine line to protect, and that could do a lot of really good things for those Nikon mirrorless cameras. I think CaNikon both kind of are going to stick to the A7 EOS M5 style body. I think that makes a lot of sense for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being that it's basically a small DSLR. And the M5 does have great ergonomics. It's very Canon with that. And so those ergonomics are a big selling point of their current offerings. And that would be a big selling point of any mirrorless offerings as well, that everything, menus up to the actual handling, are very well thought out. I think Nikon, however, could make something that looks a little bit more rangefinder, something a little bit more retro, like an AE1 or an F1. Because of the fact that Nikon does have a brilliant history of making retro-styled cameras that are digital cameras. So I think it'll kind of depend on what kind of aesthetic they think that would sell, but I think that we can expect something more modern than the Fuji-esque and retro-styled bodies, although it is a strong possibility, and I think that would be a great way to make an entry-level full-frame mirrorless camera. I don't think that's going to be the way to make a more professional option. So I want to circle back around to the lens thing because, Canon's strategy is to get you in the door with an entry-level body and then get you to work your way up with, another body or another lens and then another body and so forth and so on until you've developed a collection of lenses and bodies and you're kind of within Canon's ecosystem. That's where you live, and you've invested too much in that ecosystem to jump ship. And so they can rely on you to keep buying the bodies that they give out, even if those bodies aren't as good as they really ought to be given the current competitive market space. So I think that mirrorless full frame is something that Canon and Nikon both need to be very serious about from their own business strategy, because Nikon's done this more in the past where they've been really hardcore about that segmentation, and that's also part of what has been really hurting their business. That's what killed Kodak, for example. So, I think that's why Nikon's struggling. That's why I think that Canon has the potential to struggle going forward unless they kind of change things up. But mirrorless systems are perfect for that kind of mentality because you can't adapt a mirrorless lens to a DSLR body or to even another mirrorless system. Like you wouldn't be able to put an FE mount lens onto an EFM full frame body. You wouldn't be able to put an E mount lens onto a Nikon APS-C mirrorless body because they would make the flange different distances just different enough so that you wouldn't be able to get away with it, and so that you wouldn't be able to make an adapter small enough to be able to actually do it. So I think that would make a lot of sense for their business models to go mirrorless, actually, because then people are more locked in than ever to the lenses and to the system as a whole. So I think that could be a really, really strong business proposal for both Canon and Nikon. I think Nikon, though, I mean, they made some really excellent J series 1-inch sensor cameras, like genuinely excellent cameras, and those were really interesting because they were 1-inch sensors. They were interchangeable lens camera 1-inch sensor bodies, right? And they could make APS-C, they could make full frame. What I really want to see out of them is like this 1-inch sensor, a micro four thirds option, full frame and medium format, or just maybe even skipping full frame and going straight to medium format, having the two big ends of that spectrum. We see companies like Fuji going APS-C to medium format. We see companies like Panasonic going micro four thirds and super 35 with their cinema line. So I mean micro four thirds for their general cameras, and then super 35 or APS-C for their cinema line. So I think it makes a lot of sense for there to be some pretty big disparity. I think that would be a great way for Nikon to differentiate their mirrorless offerings. I think mirrorless gives so many more opportunities to differentiate. I could see Canon having the EOS M series like they do now, and then kind of ditching that over time for a micro four thirds and a full frame kind of thing. I think that could make a lot more sense for Canon in particular. So I don't think Canon would have as much to offer the medium format market. I don't think they would be interested in that. I think Nikon really could. They're pushing innovation. I feel like the D850 is one of the most brilliant cameras I've seen in years, including the A7R II, including the GFX50S. I think it has a lot of potential, and I think that potential is indicative of Nikon's potential. And so I'm really expecting to see some really truly brilliant mirrorless offerings out of Nikon going forward. And you know, all we gotta think about now and hope for now is release date that is sooner than later. So thank you very much for your time and for your attention with me in this video. I'll see you in the next one.